I've got a cracking one for you here today. Alexia Cambon is the head of research at Microsoft, focusing on the future of work. And the piece of work that she published in April 2025, I think is one of the most important pieces of work for any of us as we try and understand how our jobs are evolving. This work, it was the Work Trends Index report. It goes in and it explores, I think, how some organizations, she calls them frontier firms, are using this technology, and how many of us are going to be confronted with this step into agentic work and trying to work in a very different way. What I love about this research is that it's not just her opinions. She's looked at realities of where we are right now and how firms are integrating this new technology. One of the amazing bits of insight that comes from it is that right now we're interrupted in our jobs 275 times a day. If you don't think that that is having a material impact on the way work feels, the sense of overwhelm that we've got, I don't think you're taking work seriously enough. Brilliant piece of work. First podcast in 205, 206 that I've put out as a video. And so I'd just love to hear what you think in the comments. Alexia, thank you so much for joining me again. I wonder if you could kick off by introducing who you are and what you do.
Sure, yeah, very happy to be here, Bruce. My name's Alexia. I'm head of research for a team here at Microsoft called the Co-Pilot and Future of Work team. And what we do essentially is try to understand how AI is impacting how people work and what that means for companies.
And I guess your big reports. I'm not sure if you did one last year. I was looking out for it, but the Work Trend Annual Report. Certainly, there's definitely one for 2025, but it's just come out, and it seems a real step change for me from what you were saying in the last report. The last report, certainly the last one I vividly remember is 2023, which we were talking about dealing with these work demons of like the broken meeting and the blank page. And yeah, that's right. And it was like this really vivid articulation of where AI was in the moment. And what you've published right now seems far more visionary and far more articulating something that is both exciting and potentially a huge change from where you are. So I'd love you to just talk about what you think the big findings of the new report are.
Sure, yeah. And thanks for that lovely feedback. I think this year really felt like a different research process for us, because beyond just doing our annual survey of 31,000 people and beyond looking at the telemetry data, which is obviously some of the most exciting data to look through, we also just did a bunch of interviews with academics and scientists and economists to just really understand how they were thinking about the future of work. And that's really the research question we asked ourselves was, what does the future of the firm look like? And what does that mean for employees? So yeah, top level findings. I think, first of all, it's clear from the survey data, 82% of leaders said 2025 is a pivotal year to rethink strategy and operations. So we knew from the outset that this would be a year where a lot of important decisions were going to be made. The three findings we outline in the report, the first is that intelligence is now on tap. And that's a pretty unique big concept when you think about it, in the way of companies run on intelligence. They run on expertise. And up until this point in time, we've only ever really been able to access expertise and intelligence through humans. And that has often been very costly, especially if you want to access that intelligence quickly. And now for the first time, we'll be able to access that in addition to humans, outside of humans. So that was the first thing we really explored. We understood that when you can suddenly access expertise in that way, almost like buying electricity, like a commodity, that has a ripple effect on how the organization is structured. And that was the second big finding, is that human AI teams are going to become the norm. And as we start to think about AI joining the team and working with humans and having this new digital workforce, what does that mean for how we organize work and for the org chart in particular? And then the third final finding was really about the implications for the individual employee and how if we now all of a sudden have human AI teams, what will be expected of the employee and what will the employee's work be made up of. And we believe that every employee will be required to become what we call an agent boss, essentially the CEO of their own little agentic startup, and that they will be working very much with their own teams of agents that they will delegate work to.
I was trying to articulate to someone on a Sunday afternoon. So like you can imagine it's already an unreceptive audience. But I was trying to articulate to someone the findings of these. And, the notion of, you talk about a frontier firm and like how these things are different. And I was really struggling to explain to someone how work might feel different with this environment, which, I mean, you've just described 3 revolutionary changes, and I was sort of struggling to articulate it. I wonder how you sort of set about trying to describe the differences. I was trying in very tactical ways to just describe the look and feel of working with agents on a day-to-day basis. And I think possibly because this feels, even though we're using AI at the moment, it feels a few years away that we're in a team with agents. How do you try and bring it to life to people? What does their working week look like?
Yeah, well, great question. And for that, we are extremely blessed that we have access to real objective data as to what the shape of the workday looks like. And when I say objective data, I mean survey data is very much how do people feel? What do they think? But telemetry data, which is all of the signals that the M365 products emit that we collect as part of our metadata at the aggregate anonymously, that is what is actually happening. So that's our best way of really determining what does work look like. And when we did a deep dive this year, it was very clear that knowledge work anyway, information work is incredibly sloppy and very inefficient and very painful to a lot of people. So some of the things we saw, for example, is we're interrupted every 2 minutes, and that's just within the M365 suite. So that's not taking into account if you have WhatsApp open or Spotify open. Just within emails, Teams, meetings, you are interrupted every 2 minutes. By the way, my favorite part of this data is getting real life flashes of inspiration that really cause me to want to dive deep into this data. So I'll give you an example. I run commute to work, and I had this really early meeting one day. It was a 7 a.m. call. So I ran in at some ungodly hour, and 5 minutes before the call, it got cancelled. And I was incredibly frustrated and upset. And so I asked my team to look into whether or not we're experiencing a last minute culture at work. And so one of the things we looked at was in the 10 minutes before a meeting, what is the degree of editing, frantic editing happening in the PowerPoint deck? And we saw 122% boost of frantic editing in the PowerPoint deck in the 10 minutes before a meeting compared to the 3 hours before. So our hypothesis was proven accurate that there is this crazy last minute, culture happening.
Because that's one of the bits of data actually that's really caught people's attention and made people think. And that was brought about by a genuine insight of what you were experiencing.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I think, these signals that show us, and I could, go on and on, we saw that over 50% of meetings are scheduled ad hoc. We saw that, just all these signals around how disrupted and last minute things are happening really point us towards a world in which it takes work to do work. And I think you asked me, what do we think the future looks like? I think a lot of that pain and a lot of that work that we're doing just to do work will be automated, taken on by agents. And so you can imagine a world in which the last minute editing of the PowerPoint is done by an agent, or the scheduling of the meeting is done by an agent. Or rather than you logging into your Outlook in the morning and looking at your emails, you actually just go to your agent and ask your agent to tell you what are the most important items that I need to know from my inbox. So essentially, I have this theory that a lot of this very painful, inefficient work that is required to do work is going to be done by agents in the future.
It posed a really interesting question for me. I spoke to someone who'd created a new product. It's a product called Roam. It's based on an interesting hypothesis. And his interesting hypothesis is that in the office of the future, we will think about calendar zero as our aspiration rather than inbox zero. And the very his whole point is because I guess when agentic processes are dealing with the weekly catch up or the weekly status meeting, it's only things that humans need to intervene in that are going to be of consequence. And they might be spontaneous rather than just in the weekly cadence. Right. And it's such a sort of disruptive thought that I was really taken by it. And especially as I read your stuff the following week, and I wonder what your perspective on that is. Do you think that the idea that we've got this cadence of 25 hours a week of meetings, that we're constantly checking our inbox, is that going to be something we escape from, or is actually our requirement to check in with our agents going to require us being present far more? How do you visualize those specific details?
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts. I think the first, right now, all of us are paying a consumption tax as information workers on all the work we do, which is it's become so easy to communicate that we are just constantly landed with information that we have to consume and process. I think that consumption tax will shift over to the agent. The agent will be consuming the bulk of communications for us, but the tax we will pay instead is a delegation tax, where we'll be delegating a lot of the work to the agent to do that on our behalf. I think that will be very liberating, but it doesn't mean we won't be paying a tax. It will just be a different tax. In terms of calendar zero and meetings, we have some good science on this already. So we did a large scale randomized control trial of AI in the workplace. It was a 12-month study where we looked at the differences in work patterns between Copilot users and non-Copilot users. And that gave us the first real hints as to how the workday is changing based on the use of AI. And we saw that across the 58 companies that participated in this study, 6,000 subjects, that time spent on email was consistently reduced. That was the most consistent finding we had, was just less time in inbox. And if we're already seeing that just in the first 12 months of Copilot being released, I feel quite confident that that will only continue, and that potentially, rather than starting our day in Outlook, we'll start our day with our agents telling us what we need to know from email. The meetings thing is more interesting, and there's much less consensus on that. When we looked at what was happening within meetings across this 12-month period, there was no consensus. Some companies had increases in time spent in meetings, some had decreases in time spent in meetings. And that leads me to believe that it's not really about AI as a silver bullet, it's about your meetings culture. And are you really making a concerted effort to change the meetings culture by using AI, as opposed to just expecting AI to change that by default? I will say on the calendar zero piece specifically, it's interesting. I'm seeing this trend of us moving from, and our chief scientist, Jamie Teven, talks about this, moving from documents to dialogues, where up until this point, meetings have become about information exchange. We just log on to meetings to exchange a bunch of information. And I think I see an era where meetings instead become about value creation. And I'll give you a real life example from a company we worked with on this study. They had given Copilot to a group of white paper authors whose whole job was to break down the chemistry components every time a new product was released. And the way they used to do this, these white paper authors, is each white paper author would write up their section. Each specialist would write up the chemistry components. They would send it off to the next specialist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A very long, arduous, asynchronous process. What they started doing with Copilot is that everyone would get onto a call and they would write the paper out loud. And by that, I mean each specialist would say, this is what's going to live in my section. Together, they would discuss the abstract and the conclusion, and then they'd hand the transcript to Copilot, and Copilot would write the first draft of the white paper. And in that instance, you could see a world in which actually you're doing more meetings because creation happens in those meetings, not outside of
them. The whole thing poses such a fundamental question to me. You've talked about value creation, but once we reach a situation where intelligence is on tap, then one of the big differentiators that we've always had in our own competitive markets, to some extent, is undermined. And maybe it's undermined by the average quality of work in the sector going up. But we no longer have the edge of believing that we've got more talented people working here than our competitors have. And it just strikes me then that there might be value creation done in other things. From my perspective, I wonder if culture is going to be a bigger differentiator, or I wonder
Uh-huh.
if you've talked about meeting culture actually as a small nuance. That could be an interesting one. What's your take on that? What do you think are going to be the differentiators, the value creators in this world where intelligence, super intelligence is on tap?
Yeah. Everyone always asks me, like, what skills should my children build? And I think this is a slight tweak on that question that this brings to mind is what skills will AI verify? That to me is the more interesting question, because if you now have an agentic workforce working alongside a human workforce, and that agentic workforce has inherited all of the expertise that there is to inherit, whether that be legal expertise or marketing expertise or finance expertise, and that is no longer your differentiator as a human employee, what are the things that AI can't do that you can? And that to me will be the value differentiator for humans. And I think it's everything to do with, and I know this is a cliched, boring answer, but it is everything to do with the more human skill sets that are unique to humans. And by that, I don't necessarily mean, empathy, because we know AI can often present as more empathetic than certain humans. There are loads of medical studies that have been done on that. But I'm talking about, for example, my most senior clients will not want to talk to an agent about a really sensitive business deal, right? Doesn't matter how adept the agent is, that relationship needs to be protected by having a human to human connection. Speaking of, medical diagnoses, maybe I don't want to get a medical diagnosis from an agentic doctor, right? Maybe that, again, feels like I want to be sat in a room with someone looking me in the eye who I feel it knows what I'm going through, because only a human can really know what I'm going through, right? An agent is not a human. So storytelling, relationships, business transformation, strategy, all of those much more complex, less tangible aspects of the work experience, I think will be more reserved for humans moving forward.
I'd love to go back to that notion that work right now is interrupted 200. It's such a powerful data point, 275 times a day. It's such a colossal number. I remember vividly, like a decade ago, someone had a data point that we pulled our phones out of our pockets 50 times or out of our purses 50 times a day. And that seemed like a big thing. Like 275 seems like an even higher magnitude of interruption. Do you think even before we get into wrestling with these agentic disruptions, we could put our business in a better place by thinking about that experience of work right now? Do we need to do the groundwork of thinking about where work is today before we throw forward into maybe 3 years where these things are a reality? I'd love your take on that. Not least, how many years into the future are these realities?
Yeah, I mean, well, for one, what my team and I started thinking about was try to explain this world to someone in the 1950s and imagine the look on their faces. And I kept thinking about a worker sitting in the secretarial pool or sitting in their office, writing out or typing out memos, and imagining their boss jumping into their office every 2 minutes, right? Like that would be the equivalent, right? Because there was no email, there was no IM. The equivalent would be someone physically entering your office every 2 minutes. And when you think about it in that way, it does seem absolutely galling that this is what's happening to our brains within the digital ecosystem. So while I always think it's worthwhile pausing and assessing the work culture that we're in, if we know that agents are coming anyway and will be able to help with a whole load of this, my gut feel is, that is what work is going to look like moving forward. So optimize and design for that rather than going through the very arduous, hard process of changing habits. And certainly, there is good etiquette and there are good cultural norms and standards we should put in place, but we should be realistic about how effective they are when the current work culture is so insidiously filled with these disruptions. There are some that work really well, I think. I mean, for me, I think I've shared this with you before, Bruce. Like every time I'm about to send an email, I ask myself, if this email cost me £50 to send, would I send it? Right? Because we've eliminated all communication costs, so we have to reinsert those costs in somehow. But I'm very much looking forward to the day where I don't need to physically remind myself of that every time I write an email, because my agent will be working with your agent, Bruce, to ensure our communications are only ever really about the high value stuff.
I wonder if you read the AI 2027 predictions by Daniel Kokotajlo, and what your thoughts on that were.
I don't think you can be an AI researcher and not have read that, Bruce.
Okay. What was your
Well,
take on that?
I mean, I'm an incredibly data driven person, right? That's my job. So I think I always look to the science we have available to us to draw what seems like fairly firm conclusions, whilst also, realizing that every futurist who ever made a prediction, 95% of the predictions they made turned out to be wrong. So yeah, I think the 2027 report was very much, predicting and projecting out scenarios that they believed could occur. I think I always look more shorter term based on the science that we're seeing now. What do we expect could happen as the data is indicating? And so, for example, the human agent team's finding in the report, that very much came from the study that Harvard did with Procter and Gamble that really looked at how does AI join the team and what happens when you give an employee access to AI compared to a whole team that doesn't have access to AI, and can they perform at the same levels? So we, very much drew inferences from the science available to us.
The P&G study was fantastic, but I guess the one thing that study, and it was truly eye-opening for an illustration of where we currently are. People who get carried away with where we're going to be. It was an illustration of the power of where we currently are. But I guess the big difference that you're articulating here is that the agents are going to truly have agency. They're going to have some sort of degree of autonomy. They're going to be doing stuff for us. And it begs the question, when we all got communication on our mobile devices, or a generation of work. I'm not saying I was in that generation, but that was, 15, 20 years ago, when we got that, we all thought it was going to transform our experience of work. And actually what it's done is tethered us to work more than ever before. And so do you believe the autonomy of these agents is going to be liberating for us, or is it going to be deja vu, and the requirements of these agents is actually going to be even more demanding of our attention?
I think that's up to us to decide. I mean, I think it's very easy to look at the negative aspects of any new technological innovation and completely take for granted the positive aspects. And so, you mentioned mobile. Now being able to access work, on your mobile, and to be able to eliminate the very arduous costs associated with only ever being able to access your work in the physical office, in the physical, wasn't even a laptop, right? Or they called the stationary PCs that we couldn't take home with us, right? For many people, I think especially people who weren't really taken under consideration when the workplace was originally designed, I'm thinking working parents, I'm thinking young women, would have been a hugely positive development to be able to access work from home. But I think we are bound to always think about the negative aspects of these things. When it comes to agents, it's definitely a really interesting question how much the lines are continuing to blur across personal and work. And if, for example, you now have a personal agent that sits across both your work and your personal life, can you more effectively integrate your schedules so that you can manage both more effectively? And I think that, again, will be down to us humans to determine whether or not we use it for good or for bad. And at the end of the day, it's always going to be the human oversight that requires us to say, work is taking over too much. And now I am now putting a boundary in place that I refuse to take calls after 6 p.m. Or I refuse to sacrifice my 45-minute run in the middle of the day for work. Like, an agent can't do that for you. That is the human motivation that you cannot automate away. Connor Grennan talks about this a lot, and I love this as an example, which is if AI is a treadmill, you can go buy the treadmill and you can, put out the training plan of your dreams to train for a marathon, but you have to get on the treadmill and you have to run the miles. And I think it's going to be the same with agents. We're still going to need the human motivational factor to be able to use them the right way.
Final question, because I know we're out of time. But the one thing that the reason why I mentioned the AI 2027 Daniel Kokotajlo is that because I think the thing that comes across from that is that none of us are ready. None of us our corporate 5-year plans right now are not ready for what's going to happen. And the reason why I was so moved by your work is that, like, it feels a step change from the last time I read a report. And it's broadly what I would say is, you're not preparing properly for what's coming, or, embrace this because it's going to be completely disruptive. And that's why I find it interesting that when we talk about meeting culture and the notion that a lot of organizations have got 30 hours a week of meetings, and you say, well, that's down to the company's philosophy. I just wonder if, unless you're willing to embrace some much bigger degree of disruption, you are going to be one of these frontier forms. Unless you're fully embracing that your calendar is going to need to look different, the way you work is going to need to look different, that almost that's the tell that indicates that you're not set up for the change that's coming. Change seems wonderfully and abstract, and once you describe the specifics of it, people often flinch. And I just wonder if that's the one thing that maybe people need to think about.
Change readiness and willingness to embrace what's coming. Yeah. And I think when we looked at respondents in the survey that could realistically be working for frontier firms, the percentage was tiny. The people who actually met the criteria outlined, like full scale deployment of AI, high AI maturity, awareness and understanding of agents, very few people actually met the criteria. And I think it's not even looking at this from just a company level, it's looking at it from an economic societal level. And we've just published a paper where we put out the question, organizational theory is organized around the idea that we have two inputs to productivity, which is human labor and capital that augments that human labor. And we've been categorizing AI as capital because it looks and feels like a software. But if you actually look at all of the traditional criteria that we use to define capital, it doesn't meet any of them. It self-improves, it scales massively, it's elastic. And as a result, our theory is actually, what if we now had a whole new function of production where we now have human labor, capital, and digital labor, and you need to organize for that, right? Like if you think about capital, we've got IT to look after capital, to look after your laptops and your software. We have human resources to look after human labor. What do we have to look after digital labor? Like right now, it probably lives in IT, right? But should it? That's a huge question. So even just from like a structural point of view, it raises real questions about how we're going to manage and measure this new type of workforce. And the P&G study, and my good friend Kareem Lakhani, who ran that study, we've been talking about this idea of, do we need an intelligence resources department? If we have a human resources department, do we need the equivalent for agents? I'm not saying we'll treat agents like humans at all, but we'll need to have a way to measure and monitor them. We'll need to have a way to manage them. And yeah, that's just one tiny example of how much change and disruption is likely coming.
Leave me with one thing. What are you reading? What are you listening to? How are you staying attuned to this astonishingly fast-moving field?
Well, so I have my AI stuff, and then I have my non-AI stuff. So I'll give you one from each if that works. Perfect. So Mustafa Suleyman, The Coming Wave, great book. Obviously, Mustafa works at Microsoft, full disclaimer, but I want to very much stay in tune with how he's thinking about the world, because especially on that whole work personal front, I think he's thinking very interesting thoughts. And then on the non-AI specific stuff, and there's a point to this, I'm reading Catherine Switzer's Marathon Woman memoir. Catherine Switzer, for those who don't know, she was the first woman to officially run the Boston Marathon. And I've been thinking a load about women in this space and not having women be left behind in the AI race. There are a lot of male voices out there in the AI world, and Catherine Switzer was one of the leading people to bring the marathon to the Olympics, the women's marathon to the Olympics. So I've been trying to learn from how she did that to see how we can make sure the women are represented in the AI space as well.
Alexia, I thought the report this year was like a huge breakthrough in terms of articulating where we're going and not flinching from actually describing things that maybe some people might be afraid to discuss. So I'm so honored that you took the time out to talk to me. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks for having me, Bruce. Absolutely great conversation. Loved it.